Actually, with such a small group, I was thinking maybe we do Obadiah tonight. But I had second thoughts, and I said no. So we're moving on to Romans chapter 11. Obadiah, the Nabateans, all of that type of thing, you know the Nabateans. You know where the Nabateans in Obadiah resided? Bob? I got to teach Obadiah. Okay. Petra. But anyway. Okay, what's that? In the area of Petra. Okay. I think it was the Obadians, the Nabateans in Obadiah, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, without turning there. We're moving on in Romans, so if you don't have your Israel glasses, you will not understand what we're looking at tonight. But we are moving on in Romans, and Lord willing, we will finish Romans 11 next week. So we're going to look at 3 verses tonight, Romans chapter 30, 31, and 32. And as I mentioned last week, what we're looking at in this section is really a summary, certainly of the earlier part of chapter 11, but really a summary in a sense of the entire 3 chapters, chapter 9, 10, and 11. And that summary really ends tonight because the final few verses, the final, I think it's 4 verses of Romans chapter 11 are just a doxology of praise to God for how great He is, but we'll look at that next week. But what we're looking at tonight is that the unbelief of Gentiles and Jews has been the hallmark of humanity throughout history. And we only have Gentiles and Jews in the world, as we've talked about before. There are no races. I only mention that because of the time we are living in the United States, and so much claims of racism. There's no such thing as racism. There's such a thing as hate. But racism is a tool of the devil. It's a lie of Satan. It's an evolutionary thought. We don't believe in evolution. We believe in creation. God created one human race, but there are 2 people groups, Jew and Gentile, that He talks about. And so there are no races at all. So the hallmark of humanity, Jew and Gentile throughout history, has been sin. Up until the existence of the Jewish people, all you had was Gentile people at that point in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, even in the beginning of chapter 12. Because when did the Jewish people come into existence? When did they start? Jacob. Somebody's been listening. Did your wife tell you that? Jacob. Jacob. Not Abraham. Not even Isaac. Jacob. Because Abraham had initially how many sons? 2. And Ishmael's not Jewish. He's Semitic, and his offspring is the Semites from Shem, but he's not Jewish. And then Isaac had how many sons initially? 2. Jacob and Esau. So Esau is not Jewish. He again would be in the line of Shem, Semitic people. So it's not until you come to Jacob that he's the father of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation. So up until that point, really, you only have Gentiles, although you're far along the road, if you will, with Abraham and Isaac moving into having the Jewish people into the world. But prior to that, everybody still was a sinner. And so that's been the lot of humanity throughout history. And by the way, that's the focus of these 3 chapters, what it's looking at. So God's plan of redemption, what we find through Israel, would impact Gentiles, and then through Gentiles impact Jews. And we'll see that tonight. These verses that we're going to look at capture the entire purpose of chapters 9 through 11. Now, what's the entire purpose of these 3 chapters? God's mercy through Jesus is wide and all encompassing, available to both Gentiles and Jews, by grace through faith in Messiah Jesus. There's too many people who want to look at Romans 9, 10, and 11 in a very, very narrow perspective. That's because they have the wrong glasses on, by the way. They don't have their Israel glasses on. And in Romans 9, 10, 11, taught by a lot of people, is that God has chosen to keep many people out of his blessings and his mercy and his grace by his election. That is not at all what this chapter is teaching. Not at all. And so they want to narrow it down to a very select few, and the rest have been condemned by God's sovereign choice. That is not what this is teaching. What these chapters are actually teaching is just the arms open, encompassing love of God, mercy of God for the entire world. So it's not a narrow view of salvation. It's an expanded view of salvation that is being offered here, available to both Jews and Gentiles by grace through faith in Messiah Jesus. Now, 4 times in these 3 verses, unbelief is used. 4 times mercy is used in these 3 verses. And what we need to understand, in God's economy, now if I would ask you, don't read the last sentence, okay? You already have, I know. If I would ask you, what's the opposite of unbelief? Belief. That's not the opposite of unbelief in these verses in God's economy. The opposite of unbelief is mercy. And that's what we'll see here tonight. Now, we think logically, well, if the opposite, unbelief has got to be believed. No, but it's mercy. Unbelief and mercy is the opposite we find here in God's economy, which doesn't mean salvation. We'll look at that as we go through. But it doesn't mean salvation for all or belief for all, if you want to put it in that regard. But the opposite of unbelief is mercy. And 4 times each of those words are used in these 3 verses. So he starts out in verse 30. For as ye in times past have not believed God, yet have now obtained mercy through their unbelief. So even before we start to break down the verse, we can see it. You have not believed, you have obtained what? Mercy. Through their unbelief. That's the contrast. Unbelief is contrasted with mercy, not with belief. So it starts out, for as ye. Now, the people that Paul is addressing here, for as ye, the ye, Gentiles. So he's saying, as you Gentiles, is what he's saying. In times past have not believed God. And what God is writing, or through Paul, is that God always intended Gentiles to be saved. Now, for a long time in their history, they lived in unbelief. Now, this is general, because we can each think of exceptions to the rule. If you go back, I'm talking about prior to the birth of the church, in the earlier Scripture, in the Old Testament. What are some of the exceptions to the general rule that the Gentiles lived in unbelief that we know of? No. Cornelius is way too late. I told you prior to the birth of the church. Cornelius is Acts 10. The church was born in Acts 2. In the earlier Scripture, in the Old Testament, in other words, what are some examples of Gentiles who didn't remain in unbelief? There's a few. Rahab. Ruth. Who? Bathsheba. So there's others. We don't have a lot, but the occurrence of a few would suggest that there were probably more, not a large number, but generally speaking, the Gentile world remained in unbelief, in opposition, actually, to God. That was not God's plan. God always intended to have Gentiles saved. But Gentiles' unbelief, ultimately that would lead to Jews having the opportunity to be saved, but then Jews' unbelief would lead to the opportunity of Gentiles to be saved. We'll look at that as we move on. Pardon? You're still back at Gentiles getting saved? Oh, okay. It has nothing to do with what do you want to know about Melchizedek? I'm not sure. And? Okay, yes.
He gave bread and wine to Abraham, which was pretty good.
Okay. Maybe he knew Ruth. Maybe that's, no. Okay. Who was he? We studied Hebrews months ago. Okay, let's move on. For as ye, so God always intended Gentiles to be saved. We can start, for example, with the Abrahamic covenant, with the promise of salvation for Gentiles, but also Jews. But in verse 3 of chapter 12 of Genesis, it says this, and I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee, through Abram, shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now that promise of blessing would be continued through Isaac, continued through Jacob, and ultimately that speaks of salvation. And ultimately it speaks of the new covenant that would be established through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. But here we have the first indication. You could probably even go back earlier than this, but you have the first indication that God wants all families of the earth. Now, how many families are there in the earth? 2. Jews, Gentiles. Now, even at this time, there are different nations, but only 2 families, 2 people groups, Jews and Gentiles. That's why you can have in Germany today Jews and Gentiles. That's why that comparison was wrong that we talked about before we started the Bible study tonight. So God always intended that. And then when we consider the servant passages, 3 of the 4 servant passages in Isaiah, and that would be chapter 42, 49, 50, and 52:13 to the end of chapter 53. But 3 of the 4 specifically speak of salvation being brought to the Gentiles. Now, here, I'll test your biblical knowledge. Which servant chapter didn't speak of salvation being brought to the Gentiles? You only have 4 choices. And one of them is down here, so you can rule that one out. 42, 49, 50, and 52 through 50, 52:13 through 53. Which one didn't promise salvation to the Gentiles? Nobody? 50. 50 talked about the physical suffering of the servant of Jesus. Okay, but look at chapter 49. And I will, no, and he said, it is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. Now God is speaking here. And he said, it's not a difficult thing that thou shouldest be my servant, God's servant, that's Jesus, the Messiah, to raise up the tribes of Jacob. There's the Jewish people, the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth. So not only was the servant of God going to be given by God the Father for Jewish people to restore the tribes of Israel, the Jewish people, but that servant, Jesus, the Messiah, would also be a light to the Gentiles. I remember in Luke, who was it that saw the salvation coming and quoted, probably chapter 42 of the light of the Gentiles, the priest. Remember who that priest was? I don't either, so that's okay. Okay, but if you go back to chapter 2 and read it, you'll see there, and there's a great quote of a light to the Gentiles that was there. The result of the death of the servant, the Messiah, will see Gentiles saved. Now, I understand it's been a while since we were in Isaiah. And most of us here went through Isaiah. Hal, were you around when we did that? Hal wasn't. You weren't. Kathy, I don't. Kathy probably was, but you weren't either. Okay. I think it was Isaiah. Okay. In Isaiah, were you here for Isaiah? Okay. Yeah. And Joyce and Ralph? I was. Ralph, you were. Okay. Anyway. In this portion of Isaiah, in 52, 53, and 54, you have a trilogy of thought. You know what a trilogy is? 3 things. In 52, the emphasis, and this is down to verse 12, because Isaiah 53 really starts in chapter 52, verse 13. And the major thought in verse or chapter 52 is the messenger. How beautiful on the mountains are those who bring tidings of good news and stand in the watchtower and so on. A messenger. That's the major focus of the first part of chapter 52. Well, if you have a messenger has what? A message. The message is Isaiah 53, starting in 52:13. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of it, and so on. So what is the message of the messenger? Jesus, who died for Jew and Gentile. That's the message, okay? Chapter 54 tells us the result of the message. You know, if you have somebody going out and proclaiming something and really asking for a response, and that's what the messenger does, you know, because it talks back in 52 about the watchtower. And a watchtower, when you have a watchtower, what do you have? You have a man on that watchtower, at least one, and what is he to do if the enemy is coming? Warn the citizens. He doesn't have to convince them. He should be of such integrity that his word they immediately respond. But when the watchman says something, it's not like the little boy who cried wolf. Even the little boy who cried wolf, when he did it the first time, what did the people do? They responded. This is what, the third time he didn't, or whatever it was. But when the watchman cries, people respond. So when you have that, as well as the portion about the messenger, how beautiful on the mountains are him that the feet of him that brings good news. You expect a response. When the watchman cries, you expect the people to respond, right? The watchman is crying the message. He died for our sins, rose again, in Isaiah 53. Wouldn't it be nice to know what the response is to the message ahead of time? Certainly. That's chapter 54. And in chapter 54, the response of the message is, and we're not teaching this, I'm just giving you an overview of it. The response of the message is that Gentiles and Jews will respond to the message and accept the Lord. And there'll be many more Gentiles, is what it says. Which brings us to Isaiah 54:3, which is the result or the response to the message. For thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. Actually, right before this, the first couple of verses, it says, enlarge the tent. Make it bigger. In biblical days, when a son got married, where after he went and got the bride and wedding was consummated, where would the son and his bride reside? The father's house. So in that year of separation, remember that film that we saw 3 or 4 months, 5 months ago? I forget the name of it, In Fear of the Wrath or something. But when they're separated, the son goes back to the father's house and enlarges the house, the tent, because the family's going to grow. So in the first couple of verses, it says enlarge the tent. Why? God's family is going to grow. And verse 3, for thou shalt break forth on the right and on the left. I mean, it's going to come from every direction. What's going to come from every direction? Your seed shall inherit the Gentiles. Gentiles are going to come in large numbers, so enlarge the house. So what is the response going to be? Gentiles will respond to the gospel in greater numbers than Jewish people. But the key I want to point out here, even here we have that Gentiles will respond to the gospel when it's given. Isaiah chapter 53. Gentiles will be saved. The restoration of the Jews to the land of Israel will result in Gentiles coming to the Lord. This is from Jeremiah 16, verse 9. O Lord, my strength and my fortress, and my refuge in the day of affliction. The Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth, and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. So, at the end of time, what we're going to find, not at the end of time, I guess that's the wrong way to put it, but the end of the days of coming, let me leave it like that, Gentiles shall come unto God. Where? From the ends of the earth. There'll be a great ingathering of Gentiles to the Lord. Think of Revelation chapter 7. In Revelation chapter 7, after the 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe are set aside, it says, a multitude that no man can number from every nation, tribe, kindred, family, and so on will come to the Lord. But this is Jeremiah 16, verse 9. Look at verse 14 through 16, because it's all in context here what it's talking about. Verse 14, therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord lives, that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. What is that referring to? They're no longer going to talk about the Lord who brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt. What event is being referenced here? Passover. You've been to Seders, you've been to Passovers, and it's about God bringing the Jewish people out of Egypt. But the day is coming, no longer are they going to talk about the Lord who brings the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. What are they going to be talking about? The Lord lives, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all lands where he had driven them. And I'll bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. Now, Jeremiah is speaking right around what captivity? A little bit prior and into what captivity? And he was the prophet in Jerusalem. Babylon. How many nations was Babylon? One nation. But here, the time is coming that God's going to bring the children of Israel back from the land of the north and from all lands, plural. That's worldwide captivity. So no longer are they going to talk about the God who brought the Jewish people out of Egypt, but God who brought them out of worldwide captivity. That's what we see happening today. And then verse 16, it says this, behold, I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, and they shall fish them. And after I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain, from every hill, and out of the holes of the rocks. Now, a couple of possibilities with this verse. God says, first, I'm going to send fishers. And in biblical times, fishing was not like we generally have it today, or at least what we think of. Although when you do commercial fishing, on commercial fishing, do you use a rod and reel? No. You do it like you did in biblical days. Use a net. And that's generally what was used. You only fish with a rod and reel for, not that you don't take the fish home and eat it, but you're not really trying to earn a living by rod and reel fishing. It's more sport than anything else. It's net. And so there are some who say, well, what this is speaking of, there's going to be this a net of anti-Semitism. This big net's going to gather in all the fishes. alluding to the Jewish people, alluding to the judgment that's coming. And we know that there will be anti-Semitism in the tribulation period, and ultimately God is going to use that anti-Semitism to drive all the Jews back to Israel, and from there, when the Lord comes, they'll look upon him whom they have pierced. So the fissure would be the gathering in of a large portion of the Jewish people back to the land. So then the suggestion is the hunters are called then after that for what? They shall hunt them from every mountain, from every hill, out of the holes of the rocks. They're going to get all those that weren't scooped up, as it were, in the original net. I do? Okay, 16:19. Thank you. Appreciate that. Sometimes when I copy and paste, I leave it off. So 16:19. So 14 through 16 is putting verse 19 in its context. I was wondering about that as I was doing this. So 14 through 16 is putting it in verse 19 into its context. Now, some have suggested the fishers are people who will evangelize the Jews in the this is all tribulation period events, by the way. That the fishers would be fishers of men, bringing the gospel, and many will come to the Lord. But the hunters, God will use them to ultimately make the rest of the Jewish people call on the name of the Lord, because what is going to drive the Jewish people ultimately to, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord? Persecution. All the nations of the world surrounding Jerusalem, Israel. Zechariah chapter 12. So that I see that as a possibility as well. Most commentaries would say it's the first one. Arno Gabelain, in his annotated Bible on this chapter, says this. Then the voice of the prophet is heard in Jeremiah 16:19. Here it's correct. With a blessed prophetic declaration. The Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth, and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. It denotes the conversion of the world, which in prophecy never precedes the restoration of Israel, but always follows that great coming event. Now, I've mentioned that numerous times, not from this passage right here, never using Arno's quote, but he is 100% correct. The conversion of the world never precedes the restoration of Israel and their coming to the Lord. That is the catalyst that brings the world to know that Jesus is God, that he is Lord, and that type of thing. But what I want you to notice here in what verse 19 says, it says, when that happens, when they've come to the Lord, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there's no profit. In other words, they're going to finally realize, the Gentile world has been deceived. We've bought into a bunch of lies, and we've been vain about what we believe, and it's just, we've so rejected the truth about God through the years, but now we understand. Now we believe, is what he's saying. But that's the history of Gentile humanity. That is, that they have been rejecters of God, or as it puts it here, when they do respond to the Lord, our fathers. They had lies, vanities, and nothing that profited us whatsoever. And just that you can see this is the context of it. Look at verse 21 of Jeremiah 16. And by the way, we're probably going into Jeremiah after we're through with Romans. No, maybe, no, I can't even say it. I can't even say it. What's that guy's name? Obadiah. You want to do Obadiah?
You'll find out about Esau and Jacob in Obadiah.
You go to Genesis to find out about Esau. Okay. Look at verse 21. Therefore, behold, I will this once cause them to know. I will cause them to know mine hand and my might, and they shall know that my name is the Lord. And Charles Feinberg has, I believe, a great quote on this, because expositors, commentaries differ on who is this speaking of. And he says, expositors are divided as to whether the Jews or the Gentiles are meant here. Actually, Feinberg says, what is said will apply to both. There's no need to exclude either one. Because actually, at the end of the tribulation period, both Jew and Gentile recognize who the Lord is. And so, in the context, it's tough to do. Is it Jews or is it Gentiles? It's tough to come up with an answer to that. And I think Feinberg is right on. It really doesn't matter. I got to do Obadiah, so he'll keep quiet in the future. Okay, what does to the Jew first have anything to do with this? So, okay, whatever. Okay, I'll have to talk to Jeremiah when I get to heaven, tell him he had it backwards. Okay. Anyway, this is end time and Gentiles. So God intended always Gentiles to come to the Lord. But here's the problem. Go to the next page. Have not believed God. Gentiles in the past have not believed in God. This is their general condition, with some exceptions I mentioned earlier. You know, Ruth and Rahab and Bathsheba. Undoubtedly there were other Gentiles not named that we don't know of, but who did come to the Lord. But overwhelmingly, the Gentiles rejected God. They believed in lies. They were vain in their thinking. And what they did believe profited no one. Didn't profit themselves, didn't profit them families, didn't profit anyone whatsoever. Now, the word here, apatheo, the a in Greek or even Latin means no or without. Patho means persuaded. No persuasion. In other words, they were implacable. They were not able to be persuaded. And this definition goes on. It literally describes one who refuses to be persuaded and who disbelieves willfully and perversely. Apatheo, in the present context, means that these individuals possessed an attitude of unbelief because they deliberately choose to disobey, to consciously resist and rebel against authority, and finally manifest an obstinate rejection of the will, the truth of God. This is a deliberate choice to reject truth, following after falsity, the Gentile world. This has been the characteristic of the Gentile world throughout history, and that's what it's speaking of. And technically, this would take you pretty much, you could even go back to Genesis chapter 3, but certainly God's plan for the world was focused around the Jewish people from Genesis 12 to Acts 2. What happened in Acts 2? With the birth of the church, Acts 2, the gospel was available to, I left out an E on the. The gospel was available to the entire world, with the majority of those believing being Gentiles and Israel now being set aside. So now you have it switched. Where before it was primarily Gentiles who were disobedient and blinded, and only Jewish people primarily, generally speaking, coming to the Lord, and not all Jewish people. But now you have a switch, and it's primarily, generally speaking, Gentiles coming to the Lord, and Jewish people, generally speaking, not coming to the Lord, with exceptions, right? Just there are exceptions on both sides of that equation. They have not believed, and this is what this is driving at. So they have not believed God. Then it goes on, yet have now obtained mercy. These are Gentiles. Gentiles, even in their rebellious unbelief, now have mercy from God. Mercy is God's offer of grace, not judgment, to the Gentile world who deserved judgment. And one of the themes of these 3 chapters is exactly that God would be offering mercy to the Gentile world, not just to the Jewish world, but to the Jewish and Gentile world, meaning his arms of mercy are very, very wide. This is not a narrow look, as I said earlier, at a limited selection of people to an eternal destiny. This is broad. This is wide. And to read the other way into it is to do such an injustice to God's love, to God's plan. But tragically, many do. And that is not what these 3 chapters are teaching. And so I picked out one verse from 9, one verse from 10, and one verse from chapter 11. In chapter 9, in verse 30, what shall we say then? That the Gentiles which followed not after righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. Now, the Gentiles did not follow after righteousness. What was the righteousness that Jewish people were following after? The law. See, there's nothing wrong with the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law is perfect. If you could keep the Mosaic law from the moment you're born to the moment you die, where would you go? Because you have no sin. You'd be completely righteous and perfect. And so Jews follow after this set of standards, law, Mosaic law, thinking they can attain righteousness. It can't be done. But the Gentiles understood it's not by, generally speaking now, this is not meaning everyone, but Gentiles would come to understand that it's not by law keeping, it's by faith. God's mercy is shown through faith, grace through faith. And so they have attained it. Look at chapter 10, verse 20. But Isaiah is very bold, and he said, I was found of them that sought me not. I was made manifest unto them that asked not after me. That's the Gentiles. God's plan was wrapped around the Jews, but the Gentile world found God, even though they were not in God's plan for revelation to the world. And then in 11:11, Romans 11:11, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? That's speaking of the Jewish people, Israel. God forbid. But rather, through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. God allowed the Jewish people to stumble at Jesus Christ. They're not out of the plan of God. But why did he allow them to stumble? That Gentiles could come to the Lord. That was his plan from the very beginning. So in 9, 10, and 11, you have this truth that God wants Gentiles to be saved. From the very beginning, he wants Gentiles to be saved, wanted Gentiles to be saved, and he's expanding on this or expounding on this. And when we come to the end of chapter 11, he's just kind of broadening the whole thing for us and tying it all together, as it were. And then the final thought of verse 30, through their unbelief. The mercy God extended to Gentiles is a result of Jewish unbelief. That's what was talked about in verse 11. But in verses 12 and 15, it catches it also, of Romans 11. Now if the fall of them, the Jewish people, the setting aside of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? So God's setting aside the Jewish people by them rejecting their Messiah and setting them aside temporarily in his plan. Through that came what? The riches of the Gentiles. So if you're here tonight as a Gentile who believes in Jesus and you're heaven-bound, you're saved, you should be thankful, very thankful for the Jewish people, because God allowed them to reject their Messiah, that you could find the riches that you find in the Messiah of Israel, what God has for you in his mercy. And verse 15 says the same thing of Romans 11. For if the casting away of them, Israel, the Jewish people, temporarily, be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Same type of thing. Jewish people were set aside, and that brought the reconciliation of the world. Potentially everybody in the world can be reconciled to God, Jew and Gentile. And so through their unbelief, Israel's unbelief, the Gentile world got the mercies of God, the grace of God, the riches of God, a place in heaven. All of that took place. And so you were in unbelief, Gentiles. But God allowed Israel to be blinded that you might find the mercy of God and have the mercy of God. Now, in verse 31, even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they may also obtain mercy. So now he shifts, Paul shifts, he says, even so have these also now not believed. Now, that is talking about Jewish people. But again, this is a general statement. Are there Jewish people that believe? Yes. Were there Gentile people prior to the birth of the church that believed? Yes. But generally speaking, the Gentile world was believing lies, living in vanity, and teaching stuff that profited no one. Today, generally speaking, Jewish people don't come to the Lord. They're living lies, they're living in vanity, and it doesn't profit them or anybody else. But are there exceptions to that? Yes. So you see the flip, what has happened? From the unbelief of the Gentiles and through the Jews falling away, Gentiles came to the Lord. But now, Jewish people are in unbelief. And then it says, through the mercy of, and we'll get to that shortly, of Gentiles, they can be shown mercy. Gentiles are to provoke Jews to jealousy. But in a large sense, that doesn't happen. It'll only happen in small sentences, individually, when you impact an individual life. You know, I know a Jewish woman right now. She's not come to the Lord that I know of yet. We talked by phone for an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half, about a month ago. She didn't come out to the Seder this year, really, because it would have been the first time, but we didn't have it, unfortunately. But Cheryl and I have met with her and her husband, another couple prior. But she has been provoked to jealousy by a number of Gentiles in her life because of their faith. And one of the persons, her best, I'm trying to remember the story, who died, the husband or the wife, do you remember? Her best friend, I think it was the wife who lived. Her best friend died, as I remember, in a car accident and left the wife and 2 or 3 or whatever small kids. And this couple were believers. And this woman who lost her husband just grieved. Certainly you're going to grieve when you lose your spouse who you love. Grieved. But what I am told is her faith was so strong, this Jewish woman was blown away by it. Just couldn't imagine it. And has been jealous of her faith. And and the reason we talked a month or so ago was because this pandemic really has scared her. She's not old, but she's not young. She's in the mid-50s, I think, or 51, 54. But has really frightened her to death. And she wouldn't even, I wanted to meet Cheryl and myself, and anyway, she didn't want to meet. I'll talk to you over the phone. She's very jealous of the faith that others have. Believers, Gentile believers. That type of thing is what I'm talking about. So you're not going to make all of the Jewish community jealous, but you can impact a person here and a person there by what you do in their life. So, at the present time, Israel doesn't believe. This doesn't mean all Jewish people don't believe. Just as in the time of Gentile unbelief, there were a few Gentiles who believed, so today, in the time of Jewish Israel unbelief, there are some Jewish people who believe. There's always been a remnant of Jewish believers. So it's true on both sides of the equation, okay? So, in Romans chapter 11, verse 5, even so then at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace. There's always been Jewish people who believe. Now, this verse is misused so much by those who are of a Calvinistic persuasion. They want to put even so also there is a remnant according to election. That's not what it says. You know, we talked about this when we were here months ago, whenever it was. Even so, at this present, there's a remnant according to the election of what? Of grace. The election is not of the remnant. The election is grace. In other words, God chose grace to save people. That's the whole thrust of these 3 chapters, not works. The election is that of grace, not the election of individuals. We have already been told in chapter 9, 30 through 32, that Israel sought salvation by works instead of faith. That's grace. And in chapter 10, 3 through 8, salvation is through faith, grace, not works. God chose that those that come to him, whether Jew or Gentile, needed to come by grace. The election here is not individuals to go to heaven. The election here is of grace. God chose people would get to heaven not by works. You can tell the president I can't talk to him now. No, that's all right. He's got to prepare for his thing tomorrow night. But anyway, God chose we don't get to heaven by works. What's the theme of 9, 10, and even into 11? It's not of works. How did God choose for us people to get to heaven? Grace. 9, 10, and 11. The election here is grace, not works. It's very clear if you follow the context of what it is. And what does Romans 4, 4 and 5 says? Now to him that works is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. But to him that works not, but believes on him that justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. Grace. That's how God chose people to come to him, by grace. So don't misunderstand this, and the next time says, well, God chose certain Jewish people to be the remnant and others he did. It's not what this is saying. What does Ephesians 2:8 says? For by grace are you saved through faith. Not of yourselves. It's not works. That's the whole thrust here. Jewish people will come to the Lord, those who realize it's not by works, but by grace. And what's going to happen? So go to the next page. That through your mercy they may also obtain mercy. Your mercy is speaking of the Gentiles. They is speaking of the Jewish people. God wants Gentiles to have mercy that they also, Jewish people, may obtain mercy. So God desires that Gentile believers, having received mercy, share the gospel with the Jewish people in order that they might receive the mercy of God. Now, these Gentiles who have received mercy, it's implied, are the Gentiles who have come to the Lord. Mercy doesn't save you. Mercy is God's gift of forgiveness. How do you receive that forgiveness? Through Jesus, through the gospel, through faith. Mercy is God not bringing the hammer of judgment upon you, but offering you a way to have your sins forgiven. And through your mercy, In other words, that you would have mercy on the Jewish people, that God did all of this, that you would turn to them and share, that they may also obtain mercy. And the implication here again is that they receive the mercy. They understand and believe by grace. And what is being quoted here, or it's quoted back in Romans 10:19, but it's quoted in Deuteronomy 32:21. They have moved me to jealousy with that which is not God. Speaking of the Jewish people, have moved God to jealousy. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities. And I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. All the way back in the writings of Moses, God says, I'm going to use Gentiles to provoke Jews to jealousy. And Paul quotes this in Romans, and specifically in Romans chapter 10, verse 19. Now, Charles Simeon, who lived in the 1800s, has a very good quote, I believe, around this. Here's what he says. He determined to manifest his displeasure towards the Jews on account of their rejection of the Messiah, but at the same time to show mercy to them through the instrumentality of the despised Gentiles. To the Gentiles he gave a yet clearer and fuller revelation than that which he had given to the Jews. What was the fuller revelation that we got? The New Testament, the later scriptures. And he gave it not for their benefit only, but as a sacred deposit for the Jews, and as a talent to be improved for their special use especially. Remember, this is the 1800s. In bestowing the gospel on the Gentiles, he said, in fact, quote, here is salvation for you. But remember, you must not confine it to yourselves. You must make use of it for the instruction and salvation of the Jews. From you I withheld the light which I bestowed on the Jews, but I do not intend that that light which I am now bestowing upon you should be withheld from them. On the contrary, I purpose that it shall be imparted to them, and I intend to make you my channel of communication to them. See to it, therefore, that you improve this mercy aright, and that you labor incessantly for their good. For I grant this mercy to you, not for your own benefit only, though doubtless it is for yourselves in the first instance, because you get forgiveness of sins, but for them also, that through your mercy they may also obtain mercy. And that long portion right there, Simeon was just paraphrasing what this verse is saying. That I want to use Gentiles. You've received mercy because of their unbelief. You need to turn around and share mercy with Jewish people, that they can obtain salvation as well right now. He taught about this earlier. He taught about this in the earlier part of chapter 11. But he's repeating it here. Now, although not elaborated here, here's the reciprocity. Gentiles were disobedient. Jews were being saved. It's a generalism. It's a truism. Jews, though, being disobedient, Gentiles then would be saved. So the reciprocity will result in more Jews and Gentiles being saved if Gentiles follow the divine order, which goes back to Romans 1:16, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. And we've looked at Romans chapter 10, verse 1. Paul said, brethren, my heart desire and prayer to God for Israel is they might be saved. We looked at this in detail when we were back in Romans 10. The reason I believe that Paul prayed this was not because he was concerned particularly about his Jewish brethren, but he understood that when Jewish people come to the Lord, more Gentiles come to the Lord. And being the apostle to the Gentiles, he wanted to reach more Gentiles. And so if more Gentiles come to the Lord, or more Jews come to the Lord, more Gentiles would come to the Lord, which is exactly what Romans 11:12 through 15 says. So Paul is building on all of this, and he's just admonishing Gentiles at the end of this chapter. And again, this is really the end of the section on Romans 9 through 11. The last 4 verses, as I mentioned earlier, is just praise to God, the awesome God. We'll look at that next week. So more Jews will come to the Lord. Romans 1:16, Romans 10:1, Romans 11:12 through 15. Bunyan Ministries. John Bunyan, you've heard of John Bunyan. There's a ministry. He doesn't run it anymore. Obviously, he's not around. But Bunyan Ministries has this quote on it, and quoting Romans 11:1 through 36. And the chapter is the title, The Gospel in Israel's Salvation. And here's what John Bunyan said years ago, in part. The significance of Paul continuing to exhort the Gentiles in particular from verse 13 to 32. That's Romans 11, 13 through 32. Remember, that's where he started to pick it up, and he really could have even said verse 12. But anyway, ought not to be missed. The point is that a wider perspective is necessary concerning God's design for human history. So often, we are blinded by a narrow and exclusive frame of reference. Verse 18a. That requires divine enlightenment, verses 24 through 29. It's what I've said, a few other people have said. The whole purpose of 9 through 11, it's a wide perspective of history. It's a wide perspective of salvation history. It's the arms of God opened up for the world, Jew and Gentile. It is not a narrow perspective. But so many people have been bought into this unbiblical understanding, Calvinistic understanding of this narrow perspective of 9 through 11, and they missed the whole thing. And Bunyan says, don't let it happen to you. It's a wide perspective concerning God's design for human history. And God's perspective and design for human history is that His mercy, and we'll see that in the very next verse, His mercy goes out to the whole world. And the next verse brings us to the wider perspective. The purpose of Romans 9 through 11 is not to teach that a few are chosen to be saved, and the greater few are chosen to be condemned. The purpose is to show that God's plan of salvation, being through the Jewish people, in its wider perspective, embraces His mercy for both Jew and Gentile without exclusion. There's no exclusion from this mercy. Jew and Gentile can respond to it. So as we come to verse 32, here's what it says. For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that He might have mercy upon all. See, as we're finishing up on Romans 9 through 11, and it finishes really with verse 32, God's concluding everybody is a sinner. Everybody is rejecting me. Everybody is in opposition to me. It doesn't matter whether you're Jew or whether you're Gentile. So God has concluded, Paul said, everybody's in unbelief. But God wants to have mercy on who? A select few? No. Everybody. It's a wide perspective. It's an expanse that covers all of humanity, Jew and Gentile. And so I want to revisit a quote that I used in I think it was the very first lesson that we looked at on Romans chapter 9 from Austin Fisher. And I think it's fitting to revisit what he said. The emphasis from start to finish is on God's desire to let people in, not keep them out. It is about the wideness of God's mercy, not its narrowness. Israel doesn't deserve it. Gentiles don't deserve it. But nevertheless, God gives it. far from being a treatise meant to justify God's righteousness in unconditional election. Romans 9 through 11 is a treatise about the incomprehensible mercy and scandalous faithfulness of God towards His creatures through the crucified and resurrected Jesus Christ. Don't miss the importance of 9 through 11 of Romans. It's the breadth, it's the wide perspective, it's the just overwhelming love that God has for all in the world, Jew and Gentile. Yes, they're all in unbelief, but He wants to have mercy upon all. And again, don't confuse mercy with salvation. William Donald explained it this way in his commentary. When we first read this verse, we might get the idea that God arbitrarily condemned both Jews and Gentiles to unbelief, and that there is nothing that they could do about it. But that is not the thought. The unbelief was their own doing. What the verse is saying is this: having found both Jews and Gentiles disobedient, God is pictured as imprisoning them both in that condition, so that there would be no way out for them except on His, God's terms. The disobedience provided scope for God to have mercy on all, both Jew and Gentile. There is no suggestion here of universal salvation. God has shown mercy to the Gentiles, will yet show mercy to the Jews also, but this does not ensure the salvation of everyone. Here it is mercy shown along national lines. George Williams says, God having tested both the Hebrew and the Gentile nations, and both having broken down under the test, He shut them up in unbelief, so that being manifestly without merit, and having by demonstration forfeited all claims and all rights to divine favor, He might, in the unsearchable riches of His grace, have mercy upon them all. God has established and spread His mercy to the world. Without exception, every single Jew, every single Gentile in the world has been offered the mercy of God. Not all accept it because of their vanity, because of the lies they believe, and so on. But don't miss the point of Romans 9 through 11. God's mercy is available to every individual. It's very wide. I want to capture God's mercy as we close through His love two ways. The first is in a Bible verse. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. There's mercy. That whosoever, Jew or Gentile, believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. That's salvation. The mercy is to the world, everybody. And those who believe in Jesus have everlasting life. That's salvation. Mercy is available to everyone. We're going to close with a song. You don't have to sing it. But I think I love this song. It's special to me, and I think to Cheryl. This is one of the songs that we chose to be sung at our wedding. Oh my, how many years ago was that? Oh my, that was many years ago. Many years ago. That was close to 37 years ago. We chose this as one of the songs to be sung. But it captures the mercy of God. Because the mercy of God is found in Jesus. The love of God for you, for me, for Jew, for Gentile, for the world. And I don't know of a better song, there may be, that captures the love of God. Go ahead, Dan. And yes, we're gonna have to not do this live streaming if you're watching, because the rules of internet and Facebook is that we cannot show this on, so we're going to have to stop. The words are on the notes, but we can't let you listen to the song.